Welcome. This marks our final educational programming session for the Renewable Energy Cohort, where we're going to be focusing on community and environmental considerations. So before we dive into the topic for today, we're going to spend a little bit of time at looking at where different resources can be accessed by you. And then we're going to be diving into environmental considerations, community benefits, and tools for assessing solar and wind. Before the session ends today, we're going to reflect on where we've been throughout this cohort learning session and reflect on today's topics. All right, so I'm going to walk us through briefly where materials are currently stored for the renewable energy cohort within the shared drive. So we're going to continue to keep this active and notify you of any changes that get made. And now I'm just going to show really quickly where you can find this when you click on this first link right over here. All right, so when you access the drive, you're going to be able to scroll through the different content that gets housed within it. So towards the bottom, you're going to find that there's different information relating to multiple topic areas covered, such as the running FAQ that's been updated. So here's what it looks like when you open it up. It's organized by different topic areas. Then we also have renewable energy cohort supplemental resources that get pulled together from all the sessions across each one, as well as a YouTube playlist, a link to that Wisconsin Land+Water developed, and contact information. So this includes contact information for both our partners as well as your peers if you opted to share that information with us. Then if you get more into the content specifically, you can click on an individual folder. So April 21st, we talked about negotiating development agreements. And when you click on that, you'll see that it brings you to a list of different resources, including the YouTube link, specific resources on negotiating development agreements, as well as the presentation slides. Now, if we exit this folder and go back up to May 19th, you'll see that it's currently empty right now. That's because we're in the middle of a session, and at the end of this week, we'll pull all of the resources into this folder. All right, I'm gonna pull this back down. And jumping back to today, we're going to be focusing on community and environmental considerations. Tara's going to start us off with public health and environmental considerations. Then Lynn is going to share more about wildlife protections and associated standards. And then Erin is going to discuss community benefits agreements, and we'll end the presentation on assessing tools for environmental and social considerations. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Tara to kick us off.
Thanks, Tiana. Hi, everybody. My name is Tara Graham, and as Tiana said, I work for the Wisconsin Farmers Union as our Director of Conservation and Stewardship. We have spent the last 2 years, by request of our members and a lot of partners who have asked, can you really dig into renewable energy as a farming organization? Because we have few partners who have a robust understanding of farming topics and renewable energy topics. And as an organization that is very interested in distributed and diversified generation capacity, as well as stewardship, they thought that we would be a good fit for that. Our mission is committed to enhancing the quality of life for family farmers, rural communities, and all people through educational opportunities, cooperative endeavors, and civic engagement, which is the representation of our Farmers Union triangle there, which I think is good context for people to have who might be like, why are they talking about this? So you can go to the next slide, and I'll quickly talk about some of what we hear a lot as concerns from the community when we're out and doing programming. I'll do a quick coverage of the water quality implications of solar and wind projects that we're hearing from members, site management concerns. I'll quickly cover wildlife impacts, and I know that we'll get a better coverage of that from Lynn. Land use and farmland loss, waste stream analysis, catastrophe management, and public health and safety are some of the big pieces that we hear a lot from folks. Next slide. So talking about water quality, this is kind of my main background. When I was hired for Farmers Union, I was a watershed coordinator. We get a lot of questions about this in our neck of the woods, especially on karst topography, about what is the impact of putting all of this huge infrastructure onto spaces, right? It's going to have an impact on watersheds. There's a lot of considerations about groundwater management. And those tall turbines, obviously, they have to go pretty deep and have big ground-mounted impacts. So the concerns that we commonly hear for solar are heavy metals, of which we have very little research to suggest that there are heavy metal contamination concerns. We've talked to our groundwater specialists across the state, particularly in karst, and there's no research space anywhere that we can find that it is a major concern for water quality. Many of our counties that are looking at these projects actually anticipate to see a water quality improvement if they are converting farmland that was based in just a corn on corn or a corn soybean rotation. And that's something that we work with the public to do some identification of priorities and what they want to work on with that. We also see the widespread impacts of when you regrade something and when you have giant sites like solar panel areas that are going to have huge impacts to the amount of machinery going over, pile driving those posts over and over, you see compaction issues, and the regrading will cause some drainage impacts, right? So as we talked about, that's part of what you have to consider in your terms of the management plan that they suggested PSC and what the DNR reviews, but we do still have considerable concerns from the communities when they see how things look. No construction project looks good, and so sometimes our land cons are getting phone calls to complain about projects, and so we find that it's really important to have good levels of communication at the local level, and that's why the second part of our presentation from the WFU today will be on engagement in order to really react to and try to prevent some of the big headaches that can occur from these projects. You can go to the next slide. So speaking of karst concerns and wind energy specifically, because we hear this a lot from where things go, you can see that Wisconsin actually loves putting wind turbines on karst. We almost do it exclusively. So when I started getting questions from our members about the impacts that this might have, I started looking into the research. You can go to the next slide. And there's happening all over the world, really a lot of concern, but not a lot of research being done. So in Iowa, they had a senator who was talking very specifically, like, we have to be extremely careful because karst is a really fragile brownstone that we have to move forward cautiously. And that got a lot of coverage, but we didn't actually see much research coming out of that. There is an Italian study where we also have karst topography there, and they did do a study. Unfortunately, it was funded by the developer, which obviously puts things into consideration, but we have no evidence that there were concerns or changes that were negative outcomes to the project. However, we would love to see more of that. And so that's something that, as again, when we're talking about engagement, encouraging people to think through what these concerns are. If we don't have research on it, to maybe start collecting our own research and putting that into agreements for expectations, or maybe what you might want to do with your shared revenue or extra payments that you get. You want to go to the next slide? Another huge concern, of course, is site management. So I have already mentioned erosion concerns during construction as part of the water impacts, but our farmers are also extremely concerned about soil loss in terms of an agronomic impact. So you're also going to have weed and vegetation management, topsoil concerns, and those compaction. Again, those are often water issues, but they're also basic farming issues that our farmers are putting up with and concerned about. So in our Farmers Union policy, we call for full implementation of whatever you want to say that means of agrivoltaics or pollinator habitat, in terms of making sure that whatever we have for site management and the use of this land, we would like to make sure that that's going back into conservation in some way, not back into, being put into conservation in some way, or being used for farmland access for farmers at the same time. So that's a huge thing that we promote and are working with developers to try to build up their repertoire of understanding so that we can see more of that happening in general. You can go to the next slide. But the other considerations around site management are literally working with the developer on where they're going to place things. So we've had complaints from landowners and neighbors before about all of the construction materials where they get placed that causes high compaction. So that's something that we hope that in lease agreements, our folks are working on really outlining and ensuring that they have set aside placements, that they have strong soil health principles being practiced in those places. But as you can see, I don't see a soil health principle in sight in this picture. There are major concerns about how that looks. So it's really important to put that into consideration. And again, when you are building up those expectations, being aware that there's going to be a lot happening during construction that can have longstanding implications for the site. And you want to prepare for that through setting expectations and trying to prevent challenges before they arise as best as you can. Next slide. Another huge one that we hear from folks specifically is wildlife impacts. So for solar, it's been mostly habitat and access issues, right? When you convert that level of farmland and some natural spaces, we see significant impacts to corridors and even crop access for wildlife. So we did have the prairie chicken example in Wisconsin that many people are familiar with, where the National Wildlife Foundation stepped in to try and change project specifics, because prairie chickens are very unlikely to go in spaces where there is such overt human presence. There's also real concerns about migration corridors when you have 1,000-acre sites that are being fenced, right? So that's a big concern about population potential, and also for surrounding farmers. They're worried about increased predation on their own crops as there's fewer and fewer crops available for deer and other wildlife to manage there. The other big consideration is death from wind turbine blades for bats and birds. This is one area we are seeing a lot of research being done and a lot of improvements. So in the photo here, you can see that they've painted one blade black for these turbines. That is coming from some research out of Europe that's suggesting that even just painting one blade a different color reduces the blur factor so that birds are able to avoid them much better. Wisconsin, not the university, Wisconsin state actually had a new standards developed for mitigation of bat deaths by changing certain protocols on wind farms. And so when I started doing this research, I reached out to the Audubon Society and the International Bat Conservation Group to see where they found that their interests lie and what they would like to see in terms of management. The Audubon Society had said their biggest concern for wildlife health and bird health is actually climate change. So they're very supportive of renewable energy. Of course, they have specifics on what they'd like to see management. And it's very heartening to know that our PSC has changed the expectations and did go back and change those for existing wind farms to improve them. So it's not a grandfathered in situation. They are actively trying to improve them. And I'll let Lynn speak more to the fencing considerations, but that is one of those big pieces that we have to be aware of for wildlife impacts. Next slide. And their DNR does have a map of where they find that we have high priority spaces where wind turbines should not be for wildlife and bird corridors. I did a quick comparison of this for our presentation coming up in Columbia County, and you can see that it is mapped very specifically. Those turbines are placed just outside of those spaces. This is a publicly available map that you can find and make sure that sites are working outside of those boundaries. And ideally, you have buffer zones around those as well. So we do have some public access sites, which we're encouraging folks to double check, triple check to make sure that when they're looking at siting, they can have an understanding of where their priority corridors are. Next slide. Another big concern that comes up, but isn't always felt like controllable, of course, by communities, is the waste stream considerations. So solar is considered highly recyclable, even though there's only one facility in the United States that does recycle solar panels at scale right now. Turbines are definitely not considered recyclable. Every once in a while, you'll see a news story that's suggesting that they have created some, but they are not widespread adopted yet. There's also concerns about the oil use in turbines as part of the waste stream and management. Those do have to get changed. And then the heavy metals in panels is a question that we get really, really frequently from people. In the PSC application process, the developer does have to disclose what type of panels that they're using, so you can quickly identify what type of panels and get the information that you want to. We have seen communities set up expectations for using, panels without cadmium in them, which is becoming the industry standard, but it is something that communities can be aware of and try to reduce. The oil project in turbines, that one has been not as well understood. Obviously, if a turbine is leaking oil, something is significantly wrong with that turbine, which is not in anybody's interest. So sometimes we find that that's more of a communication issue to ensure that the developer is aware that there might be an issue and that they can try to resettle that structure so it's correctly vertical or other products like that. The other challenges, even when, these are considerations for when everything goes right, eventually everything wears out, right? And so there are some real horror stories of like communities in Minnesota where a developer owner goes bankrupt and then the turbines are left there, right? So ensuring that there's a bond or some sort of funding, that there's a waste stream of potential to manage that actual product that gets left in the community. We want to make sure it does not get left there, and that there is a way out mechanism to ensure the community isn't stuck like some folks have been stuck. There's also the concern about catastrophic event damage, which I'll cover a little more deeply, but obviously when you have, just like if there's a trailer park or a community and a tornado goes through, there's going to be a lot of debris left everywhere, right? And so that does cause major concerns for people who have already significant concerns. Next slide. So when we're talking about life cycle management and requirements of materials, I think it is important to remember that we have materials concerns. There has been a really good analysis done, and here you can see a comparison. So photovoltaics there over on the right side do represent a high use of a lot of metals that we don't see use of in other forms. However, there's also hard to find somebody who can say all of the waste that might come, because you'll notice that the hard coal doesn't include the actual coal use, right? Which can be tons and tons per household. So we're always at the Farmers Union trying to do comparisons, because we try to speak in terms of not yes or no wind, but electricity how, and what gives the communities the most benefit to the least cost. And so it is important to note that there are significant waste streams to these products that we're not necessarily used to using. You will note that a lot of these material requirements are recyclable rather than being burned in general. Next slide. Oh, go back one. Yeah, thank you. So another huge one that we are probably most commonly hearing from folks as major concerns around, especially solar, somewhat to wind, but not nearly as much, is the land use and land loss. And this can be really realistic for folks who are seeing this. It might represent just a tiny portion of the total acres in their area, but for a farmer, the acres in their area is very different, and it can represent a sizable portion of the acres that they would like to have access to. So this is a real concern for some people who have been maybe looking at an aging farmer's property and hoping to lease, and they'll have really, really strong feelings about the fact that it has been instead leased to a utility monopoly, right? So the land use and land loss is considerable, and this is part of why at Farmers Union we're very set on promoting the use of agrivoltaics so that the land can still be farmed, especially for beginning and small farmers who might have better land access options by doing this. And also the farmers who then have access to this are often paid for the vegetation management that they're doing, as opposed to paying for the land itself. If we can go to the next slide, please. Again, I think it's important for folks to consider that there is land use and acreage requirements for all forms of electricity. You'll see that nuclear power is lower. Gas plants can be lower as well, although fracking considerations that our farmers are complaining about are very real. But in terms of hydropower, coal power, and concentrated solar, we're still seeing very significant acreage requirements. The loss of farmland acres is nothing new as a concern to the Farmers Union. American Farmland Trust has also been a huge actor in our concern over the loss of farmland. This is still, yes, a concern to many people. However, we still find that most of our farmers are primarily concerned about the loss of land to housing developments. It obviously depends on what county you're in and where urban sprawl resides, but it is really important now that we're hopeful that more communities will be taking into account the potential of renewable energy and other developments as part of their comprehensive land use and management plans, because it's becoming so apparent that we will need to be taking this into account in a different way. Next slide. All right, and finally, just public health and safety. I wanted to note that there are a lot of public health and safety concerns that our communities bring up. Usually it's the first thing that comes up, and communities will often be accused of, or there's a feeling from folks kind of one layer above the ground that, oh, they're just saying that because it's misinformation, or they're just saying that because they know that's what they have to do to fight this at the PSC level. However, there are a lot of people who have legitimate, real concerns, and I want to make sure that we're not mitigating those when we're talking to people, but also not being inflammatory or overly zealous in presenting them. So first and foremost, you can talk to any of the foremen who are actually on sites for the construction of these projects, especially putting in putting in solar panels. It's noisy, and it's noisy for a long time pounding those posts. So that's a real nuisance concern, but also a general health concern and safety concern, especially if you have livestock for people. So we have a lot of folks who are just, it's imperative to be aware that that's a real cost that some neighbors are going to have to put up with if a project does pass in a neighborhood, and to understand how you're going to engage with those neighbors to ensure that they're able to still enjoy their time in the community. Wind turbine flicker, noise, and sound waves. So this is a funny one that when we talk to people, many people dismiss this as not real. We have seen fights within our membership with people who don't think that this is real, but for some folks, they have really significant concerns. For the most part with wind turbines, flicker and noise is just an issue of setbacks, which are becoming the industry standard, especially from residencies. However, there can be kind of tricky situations where there are certain weather conditions or certain topographies that handle things differently. So at the WASH conference a couple of years ago, I had a farmer say, it's just when it rains, the sound from the turbine bounces off the hill behind me and it makes my whole house vibrate, right? And so that's a concern that nobody necessarily would have seen coming. And it's important to be able to communicate that to the developer, which again goes back to having a stream pathway for engagement, because of course that person should be able to say, when the weather conditions are X, Y, or Z, this turbine shouldn't be on, right? Because also the developer should have an interest, aside from just being decent to their neighbors, that they don't want those sound waves coming back and disrupting the inner workings of that turbine. Inverter noise is one that comes up. We find that on solar panels, inverters are generally centrally located to the projects and often aren't louder than a refrigerator. So we have people bring that up as a concern, but it's not generally, once they experience it, it's not generally their greatest concern. Again, we see the catastrophic event impact. So a catastrophic event. So people are really worried about if there are high wind situations around a solar field. Will something hit their house? Will there be road damage? Will there be there's a narrative out there that some people are really worried that they aren't going to be able to grow crops in soil under solar panels. We've been asking around for a source on this one. We're not able to find anything on heavy metals that some people like to say it is. It sounds like some potato growers have real concerns about broken glass and the potato growing up around a shard of glass, which of course would be a very bad situation. So understanding kind of some of the nuance of those discussions, I think, is important, because it's really easy for these to get away from folks, and they can kind of say half understood things, which can reduce the compellingness of their argument in other ways, and it can also get more people discomfort with it. So we try to really make sure that folks are speaking and have really good information, because there are really legitimate concerns, and we want to respect those and also ensure that we're staying on accuracy. Other health and safety and kind of nuisance concerns are glare. That's usually taken care of through screening, but should make sure that someone is paying attention to that to ensure it is taken care of. We get a lot of questions about stray voltage and electromagnetic frequency questions. We've talked to quite a few people on this one, as questioning whether it's real or not. For solar projects, we do not anticipate any problems with stray voltage for a project that is properly grounded. So you might want to, as a community, ensure that you have someone out who does not work for the developer to ensure that the projects are properly built and tied into the grid successfully. If they are tied into the grid, you should have no problem with stray voltage, because they're grounded throughout the project so frequently that shouldn't be a concern at all. Again, it's the same for wind turbines. Stray voltage is it's not likely at all. Stray voltage is much more a transmission issue. And then for the electromagnetic frequency, I had a developer, a rural electric co-op owner, talking to me, or the president of it, and he said they had one person in their territory who was extremely sensitive to that. She actually has to turn off her fuse box in the house because electromagnetic frequency causes her to cover in a rash. They said that is a real concern for some people. However, when we do the reading throughout the house, it is much, much higher because of all of the electronic appliances that people have than it is standing in the middle of the generation facilities that they have. So it's something that comes up, but when people who are really familiar with it and sensitive to it talk about it, we don't find it to be a concern in renewable energy spaces. We're happy to be corrected on that, but at this time, that's what we've been hearing from the public and from the experts on that one. And then again, fire and emergencies. So especially with battery storage now, which is not the topic that we're covering today, but just in general, having an emergency plan and communication with your fire response team to really think through what they might need in terms of things and have a way to communicate to the owner and the utility about projects is really, really important. At some point, some car is going to go through a fence, right, and hit a solar panel. That's going to happen at some point. At some point, something's going to go wrong with wind turbines, and the people on the ground who live next to them are going to be the first to see it and are going to bear some of the risks of that. So being able to communicate that upstream is going to be really important. And so next slide. I've already covered catastrophic management a couple of times. There are real concerns that people have. So again, building in whatever safety mechanisms you can, just as you should do with any other development project, is pretty important. Mostly fires with battery storage, tornadoes and high winds come up a lot as concerns, particularly with solar projects. And then flooding and hail damage are also common concerns that get brought up from people. Obviously, the industry tries to minimize this as much as they can every time that we've asked them about it, but it's still, none of us can completely protect ourselves from the whims of Mother Nature. And so communities are going to have to figure out how they can ensure that there is funding available for cleanup. Sorry on time, I will keep going. One last thing, none of this matters without competent and good faith actors and trust. So one of our huge points that we make is that when you are working on these agreements that we're hopeful that communities will make in terms of negotiating for themselves the best deals that they can, that they keep a good line of communication to ensure that they're talking through with people everything that they can do, and know when there's a problem, because a problem will arise, who they can talk to and how they can act with the best interest of the community. Sorry for how long that ended up being.
Okay, I'll go next. My name is Lynn Markham. I'm a land use specialist with Extension and at UW Stevens Point. I'm going to spend about 3 minutes talking about solar project potential impacts on wildlife and best management practices to minimize those. And also acknowledge that depending on how a solar project is built and what the vegetation is, it could be a positive or negative effect. Next slide. Okay, so the main best management practices I'm going to talk about are siting the solar project, having corridors for wildlife, either maintaining existing corridors or creating corridors, and then what type of fencing is chosen to let wildlife species through the fence. So I'll start with siting. So the main goal is to avoid siting solar projects on or near adjacent to valuable wildlife habitat. So these are our state wildlife areas, our federal refuges, high quality forests, grasslands, and this is a challenging topic. We see that the PSC and DNR focus on endangered and threatened species, as well as unique situations, for instance, an eagle's nest. Just to give you a little bit of feel for scale, when you look at this slide, the orange outline is around 130 acres, and that's a fairly typical solar array. So that's a half mile on each side. If you look at solar array 10, the green one a little bit north of there, that's a 40-acre parcel. So that's a quarter mile on each side. So the size of the array matters in terms of how far around an array wildlife would have to go. Can you click it one more time? And then this is a very large scale solar project. And my point in showing this is to try to avoid outlining or having solar projects immediately adjacent to it, and also to ensure that wildlife areas are shown on maps. If you need help with that, your county land information department may be able to make maps for you showing the wildlife habitat. Next slide. The next step is corridors, wildlife corridors. So a couple of best management practices to reduce impacts. One is to divide large parcels. This was done on the Vista Sands project. It's included in their JDA. So what you can see here, this Array 9 was originally around 600 acres. And that meant that the fencing on one side was a mile long. So what was included in the JDA was that parcels 320 acres or larger would be split so that they were only a half mile on a side or 160 acres. Next. And then the other piece is maintaining wildlife corridors along waterways. Our waterways are natural wildlife corridors. And so keeping the fences back 75 feet from navigable waterways and having a setback on those non-navigable or smaller streams to also allow the wildlife to move through there. Next. And then fencing. The fence height being lower allows deer and other animals to get over, avoiding barbed wire on top of the fences except substations, and then utilizing wildlife permeable fencing, a commonly used term that really needs to be defined in a local agreement. Some different options are to raise the fence 6 to 8 inches off the ground. That's the preferred option. The fence shown here on the right is a specific wildlife friendly fence, and you can see the gray fox hopping through it. So I've got the name of that fence. And then the other option is to have the larger openings in the fence at the bottom, preferably at least 8 inches tall. If you can click one more time, you'll see a photo of, this is a solar fence. That's my hand near the bottom. That's only about 4 inches wide. But if the fence had been flipped so that the larger holes were near the bottom, it would allow more wildlife through. So that's what I've got. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. I will go next and I'm going to try to go fast. My name is Erin Leninger. I'm a conservation coordinator with Wisconsin Farmers Union. We're going to talk about the power of people and engaging in your community. Tiana, next. I'm going to say next a lot. All right. Again, we're moving forward thinking about the fact that in our communities, we're facing development in all kinds of ways, but and we can decide if that's good or bad for your community, yes or no, but we also should be talking about what's the responsible way forward. Next slide. That's my prettiest one. Soak it up. Okay, so there's lots of ways for communities to engage in this process when we're talking about this. We've talked about the PSC process. It's important for communities to understand what that is, where they can engage, what those comment periods are called, how long they are, how you do that. We are trying to encourage and educate everyone on that. We're also learned about utility aid. Our community members need to, and our decision makers need to understand what that is, how much you get, how you decide what to do with that, and then communicating that out. Hopefully that's guided by your community vision and planning and input of what you're doing with that shared revenue, utility aid. Of course, people can engage in public meetings, local municipalities, open houses from developers. Those are very important, but there are barriers. Those are not enough usually. And then of course we have power when we vote too. But what we want to talk about is using multiple pathways to protect and bring benefit to your community. And so we're going to talk about organizing and negotiating for a local contract to support your community as well. Next slide. This should be a little bit of review. You've heard about joint development agreements. Hopefully JDA is ringing a bell. These are usually project specific, technical, they're related to the permits and the zoning and the approvals that are needed, often related to construction. We've heard people say, confirm your financial commitments within those as well. These are usually signed by a local government. Now, we've floated community benefit agreement to you as well. So a CBA, very similar, but you can see community is within that. It's driven more from the broader community, and it can consider and address these broader issues that are social, environmental, like we just heard, but even economic, labor, professional, and cultural considerations. And this can be signed by a broader community coalition or foundation or institution. And they are sometimes also signed by local governments. Next slide. This one's quick. So they're both legally binding contracts, and they can be called different things like host benefit agreement. The verbiage is not necessarily what we should get hung up on. But I want to just say again, there's some that are negotiated by the few. There's a sense that it's less transparent, and maybe we can just make that more transparent, or we can have a CBA a negotiated contract that is truly driven by more people within the community. In Wisconsin, we only have one CBA. You've heard we have many JDAs, okay? Again, I don't want to confuse you, but it's good to get the verbiage. The one CBA that we have is actually for the Milwaukee Bucks Fiserv Forum, and it was very labor focused, right? Someone with a lot of money is making more money by doing that development. What they did was sign an official CBA to help the workers, the people who live nearest it and work in that building, to have a living wage and to unionize and to improve their quality of life. That's what drove that. And that was signed by the developer and the community. Next slide. So again, this is 3 quick slides. We're taking community priorities, concerns, probably what you've put in the chat, what Tara and Lynn alluded to, what we're most concerned about: wildlife corridors, toxins that could get into the ground. We need to gather those together. We need to prioritize them, and then we have to move them into language that we can ask in a contract, that we can negotiate with the developer that's coming to us. And I have too many on here, but you can see on the bottom here, this communication pathway, community liaisons, full-time personnel, 24/7 hotline to call. That is one that Tara alluded to a lot. We talked about fencing. You can click the next slide, Tiana, as well. There's a lot, right? This would be a big list. The noise concerns, the flicker and shadow. We need to learn what the biggest concerns are, and then we need to look and learn from other communities about what could we ask for. And again, it's a negotiation, so we're going to put a lot on there. And if we can get into that negotiation space, maybe they're going to say we can't do that, but maybe we can do this, right? So we're going to brainstorm and give a lot of options of ways to protect your community or to add benefit. And if you go to the next slide, again, a community benefit agreement broadens that open. We're looking at what the county needs and wants to be in the future, what concerns are that maybe aren't specific to that construction site, but that the community does want and need. We can start to put those into these asks for a community benefit agreement. So you can see here, let's dive into education. Maybe you need to beef up. I've lived somewhere where the ambulance service was pretty terrible, and I was pretty scared that someone would have an emergency. You could beef that up. We all need help with childcare access, maybe our local health systems. You can think broadly about that, come up with your terms, and include that in a CBA. Next slide. I'm going to go quick here too. Okay, but you're like, Erin, I've never heard of this. How would I learn about that? You could ask me. I know this much more, but there are databases out there that you can check. There's, I'm just going to list a few. The World Resources Institute. This is very easy to navigate. It's like a drop down. You can go by state. You can go by type of agreement, and it will show you verbiage and sometimes link to the text of the agreement. Okay, sometimes. Next slide is just another one that I've been peeking around. The Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. You can click on solar, you can click on wind, you can click on all the different ways. And they have these for like landfills, other energy generation, other developments, like I said, a stadium, right? So you can peek around and learn a little bit about what other places have done. Next slide. So here's some quick examples. This is a 23 megawatt, I can't believe it, Next Era Energy project out in New York. You can see that like the developer, if they're saying we're going to give you some money, here you go. They wouldn't be able to say that they want a basketball court, a swing set, and a walking trail. That has to drive from the community saying that's what they need and that's what they want. I will go really quickly. A mural, a new bathroom at a park. Okay, they came up with how much money they need for it and where they want it. Next slide. This one is this was like a combined cycle gas generation one, but you can see it was signed with the city of Salem and then the power company. This is 2 slides, but you can see they didn't just say we're going to make a scholarship. A lot of developers will say we're going to start a scholarship fund. They wanted it specifically to go to digital initiatives, athletic programs. They improved a particular sidewalk. Again, community driven. It has to come from there. And then obviously this would have a huge environmental impact. And so you can see they put a lot of money into other sustainability initiatives and emission reduction programs. Next slide. Oh, more stuff. Fire department. I love the term traffic calming measures, and something we can learn from access for cruise ships. So maybe we can't copy and paste this. Next slide, but it can be helpful to peruse. So I know that many people are like, Erin, that's just a bribe. We're just asking for a little more money so that they can say that they have our support. And I know that's one way to look at it, for sure. But I challenge us to think of ways that we can have development go beyond the bare legal minimum, because I think that's what most of them would do if they could. This is a space where you can say, you're saying you're improving our community. We are telling you from our community what that is. It's local determination. It is a way, again, to hold them accountable if they don't do something. And the reason I get excited is it can show community solidarity in a way that is really strong. Developers can move into communities if we're broken off and fractured and we're really upset, but we're not really together. That's an easier space for them to come in and not have to do much for your community. If they come into a space and they're interested and you say, awesome, we know exactly how we want you to be a neighbor here. We know exactly what we want. We've all talked already. Here is our bar. This is what it takes. They're more likely, I can't say that, I haven't done research, but they're more likely to try to engage with you to hit that, or maybe they don't want to engage with someone that's so gosh darn organized. Okay, so set the bar high, and obviously this would be helpful in your communities for other development and in the future anyway. That's my daughter high jumping. She just jumped really well at the conference last night. Next slide. I will probably skip over this. I know you're thinking, why would the developer do this? They want to appear like a good neighbor. They want to do more business elsewhere. They're going to want to point back here and say, look, they liked us here. Look what we did. Okay, so we can feed into their own words. They're already saying they're out there doing it. And of course, they are looking for more support. But then again, some communities can make this a necessary piece of approvals, permits, and zoning. You can say that if you want to come develop here in this space, I'm not the expert on this, but you can say you need to enter into a contract with us. So understanding your leverage points, understanding your community, knowing what to protect against and what to ask for is so, so important. Next slide. There's a lot of words. This is how you would do it. You would do education and awareness. That's what we're doing right now. We're learning the word community benefit agreement. We're learning that we have to engage really good and hard, and then we have to bring that together to create our community priorities, list them in order, know what we're going to ask for, turn that into terms, negotiations, and asks. We need legal help. We're going to engage with the developer to draft that agreement. And then once we have it signed, we can implement and enforce. This is a space where you can get nervous, but you can build into the agreement how that's going to be done and who's going to be doing that. Next slide. Okay, so what it takes is that engagement. Tara and I are passionate about this. It needs to be inclusive, transparent, consistent, bi-directional, right? We're trying to make this as transparent and open as we can, and I know that's hard. We need to give people multiple ways to engage and give feedback. It takes leadership and community coalition. We need to have someone that says, I'm going to try to make sure that if development comes in my community, that it's going to be the best thing for us, that it's going to be responsible for our children. And then you do need a relationship with the developer. I'm not naive to think, and I know that there's areas where the developers aren't open to this. So I think it's really unfortunate, but if we can, in our negotiations, when you're first starting to deal with them, if you can inform them of your intention that this community is going to have priorities and benefits that they expect, you can let them know that that's happening. And then we need to try to keep channels open and clear as much as possible. I know that that's not happening in every space. I understand that. But trying to leave that as an option for your community, as a pathway, one of the pathways forward at least, is really important. Next slide. Okay, these are like Lynn's tips. I stole them, and I think they're mostly the same. So again, you need your priorities. You need to divide and conquer. This can't be done by one person or just a few in a closed room. You need to lean on your local experts. Tara spoke to this. You know, you have environmental people who are experts in your community. They know what to ask for, what to look for, and what to do if something's going wrong. They should be absolutely included in the conversations, in the discussion, in the negotiations. This is a contract. We can't say please, maybe, shall, right? It needs to be strong, clear contract language with people who are responsible. And then once you have it, you need to share it broadly and make sure everyone knows that you have that in place so that you can help enforce it, and that everyone knows, even if things switch hands, who's responsible for what and what you can do. I know I sort of shouted that really quickly, but that's the end of my slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, so much. All right, so this is our last content-focused presentation for the day. I'm going to show you a practical tool that gives decision makers a way to assess development potential for specific sites that was developed by the Nature Conservancy. I'm going to walk through briefly the goals and data that informed the tool's data layers, and also highlight some key features and its applications and nuances. All right, so diving in, who the Nature Conservancy is, we have three primary pillars of our work, which includes protecting land and water, tackling climate change, and sustained food and water. So this tool specifically sits within our tackling climate change, and our goals relating to renewable energy is to accelerate clean energy deployment in the right places. So that means directing projects to previously developed or low impact areas wherever possible. So this photo here that you're seeing is a former mine land where solar energy was developed. So reclaiming degraded sites for more productive energy uses. So as we had discussed earlier in sessions, energy demand is growing pretty quickly. So that makes where energy builds really important. So TNC's framework for evaluating this includes the 3 C's. So that includes projects that honor communities, conservation, and climate. So for communities, supporting an equitable energy transition that delivers tangible local benefits, conservation by avoiding and minimizing impacts to wildlife and habitat, and lastly, climate. So projects that maximize greenhouse gas reductions. So this 3 C's framework really informed the foundation for how the Renewable Opportunity Explorer was developed. And we'll get into that a little bit more right now. All right, so taking a look at the Renewable Opportunity Explorer, this is a tool that was built by the Nature Conservancy to help communities, planners, and decision makers see where renewable energy projects are likely to emerge and what environmental factors are at play and social considerations. So this data, just to tell you a little bit of background, comes from TNC's Power of Place, specifically for environmental suitability and social suitability. This is a national framework for assessing land suitability for low impact clean energy deployment. Then from Argonne National Labs Geospatial Energy Mapper, GEM, that provides development potential data based on energy infrastructure and renewable resource quality. We also have some exclusionary and opportunity layers as well, including the USGS Protected Area Database. So that's identifying areas that are legally protected or have really high development. So when we get to the maps in a little bit, you'll see this showing up as no scoring. We also pulled in site renewables right data to identify critical habitats and environmental populations as well. Lastly, which we won't spend too much time on today, is mining the sun. So this showcases underutilized or degraded lands like former landfills and mine sites, like the picture that we saw earlier. All right, so getting into the different scoring layers, I'll show you a few data layers, and we're starting off with development suitability. So understanding where projects may be more likely to occur is one of the first steps in proactive planning. The 2 maps here on the left-hand side is solar, and then on the right-hand side is wind. And this legend here is showing the development suitability. Now, as we're looking through each of these layers, one item to keep in mind is that scoring and data pulled in from sources is looking at 400 acre square parcels. And this will become more clear once we kind of dive into the different functions. So development suitability can tell you or help you understand where there are high development potential and where proactive planning could be useful. Now getting into social suitability and beyond physical development, ROW also incorporates some social factors as well that can help speak to how a project might affect or be perceived by surrounding community members. These factors on the right-hand side of the screen with the check marks includes the different factors and scoring mechanisms that went into this. The map that we're looking at is specifically for solar. And one thing that's really helpful about this tool is that it allows you to bring in additional data sets beyond what TNC has developed for different suitability layers. So for example, you can overlay USGS soil productivity data, so down here, to deepen your understanding of specific parcels. This layering capability can be really helpful to how the tool is meant to be used, specifically iteratively and with multiple lenses being looked at. So now we're just going to take a quick look at environmental suitability. This map is specifically showing environmental suitability for wind energy development. So those yellow areas indicate areas with potentially less environmental conflict, or another way to say it is more compatible with conservation values. Environmental suitability data will draw on a wide range of different data sets in this area here. So wetlands, managed areas, intact habitat, and then other species habitat as well. So this can provide guidance on environmental factors within a given region. So a high suitability score does not necessarily mean a project's going to get approved there or that no concerns exist. It just suggests fewer conflicts based off of scientific data. Now, we already talked about this a little bit, but because row has many different data layers comprised in it, one I'd like to call out specifically is one that Tara mentioned earlier, which is the DNR's key avoidance areas for wind energy turbines. And once we get into the use case, you'll start to see how those function together. All right, so diving into the practical mechanics of using row, the tool gives you two primary modes of analysis, one being suitability filtering and one being site suitability. So the suitability filtering function might be best for proactively planning because it allows you to search across the entire landscape and use custom criteria to identify areas that meet specific thresholds. Then for site suitability, this is best for evaluating a specific location. So it would allow you to draw a site boundary and receive detailed data on that exact site area. So we're going to start off by looking at site suitability. So we're looking up at a map of Ashland and Bayfield counties. No specific reason other than the fact that my boss lives up in that region. So you're exploring and playing around with the map to see how it looks in his neck of the woods. So this is an example of the site suitability function specifically for wind energy. So this boundary here that I highlighted is a proposed wind development suitability layer. The selected location shows relatively high development potential across the key parameters. So as you're seeing this light green, it's saying that there's a lot of good energy infrastructure and maybe really high average wind speeds. So from a development standpoint, it might be a really attractive site. Now, once you select this area, you'd receive a couple different data insights, including environmental, social, development suitability, and key important environmental factors coming from site renewables, right? As well as state data of presence. So when I selected this site, the tool told me this message outlining that the DNR map for migratory birds and bats recommended avoidance area is located within the site location. So that I moved over to the next map and turned on that layer, I was able to see that the whole area that I had selected was in that area. So this is why the tool works really well when you use it iteratively, running environmental and social layers together to be able to get a holistic view of a specific project site. All right, the last aspect of the tool that I'm going to show you today is looking at suitability filtering. So this might be helpful identifying areas that meet specific social, environmental, and development conditions. So on the left-hand side, you can see that I selected suitability filtering. I wanted to consider high development potential, pulling in site renewables right data, the absence of protected managed lands, as well as the absence of prime farmland. So the result that you get from that is this. So it's a set of 400 acre grid squares scattered across the landscape that is essentially satisfying those three conditions at the same time. So this filtering mechanisms allow you to explore social environmental criteria and find where they're met across various landscapes. So in closing for this part of the presentation, the Renewable Opportunity Explorer can help identify where development is likely to emerge. It can also provide environmental considerations for a project. It can also help prepare for conversations with developers, regulators, and community members. However, it is not a final decision-making tool, and it doesn't necessarily tell you where exactly projects should or should not go. As always, it's not a substitute for formal environmental review or other review processes, and analysis still does require a more hands-on approach. The best way to think about it is that the Renewable Opportunity Explorer can allow access to a lot of different scientific data, and its value really depends on how it's used. So treating it as a starting point for informed proactive engagement and understanding of what's within your community can be really helpful, but it's not a substitute for local expertise, of course, community dialogue, or a formal regulatory process. So the links here on the left-hand side will take you to the Wisconsin Renewable Opportunity Explorer story map, which will provide a lot more detail on the different data layers that go into it and some how-tos on how to use the tool. And then the open access one is the link below. And with that, we're going to pass it off to Peter to take questions.
Thanks. Hello, all. My name is Peter Levi. I'm Tiana's colleague at the Nature Conservancy. We had some really great presentations today, so we packed a lot of information in. So we are going to hold off on answering questions right now. I'm reminded that we will be meeting again for an optional 7th gathering in 2 weeks on June 2nd. And we will be able to stick around a few minutes after 1 p.m. So if people did want to hang on and had a burning question, we're happy to stick around, but we want to respect people's time. So Tiana, I'm going to pass it back over to you to wrap up this amazing 6-session cohort.
Great, sounds good. Thank you guys for all of your patience and sticking with us throughout these presentations. We hope that they're really helpful for you. I actually don't know if I'm sharing my screen anymore. Sorry about that.
You're not.
There we go. Okay, you should see a slide that says Renewable Energy Cohort. This was the first slide that we ever presented to you all on March 10th. But we just wanted to take a quick moment to start off with thanking each and every one of you for taking the time to learn about solar and wind energy projects. When thinking back about what our collaborators were hoping with this process, we started out by building a shared understanding of some of the challenges and opportunities, such as gaps in access to neutral information, being prepared with timelines, and these complex systems and relationships. So we wanted to create a space where we can share practical guidance, facilitate peer learning, and alleviate the weight of learning alone in order to increase decision-making capacity. So we explored a lot of different topics. Either we had collaborators come in and speak to you about their areas of expertise. We also welcomed guest speakers to share expertise on areas like developing local regulations or negotiating a joint development agreement. And in the peer group discussions, we got to explore a lot of different topics and perspectives. So as we're wrapping up the Renewable Energy Cohort, we just want to sincerely thank all of you for the work that you do in your communities, for taking the time to navigate really complex information with us, and for sharing your experiences and perspectives with everyone. While the programming for the cohort is coming to an end, we hope that the conversations, tools, and questions we've explored together continue to be really useful for you. Now, today, Peter had mentioned as our final educational session, we are hosting one more on June 2nd, just to create more space to connect. And we'll be reflecting on the session, hopefully later today or on June 2nd. But we're also really interested in learning from you about your experience with the cohort as well. So Diane created a really awesome evaluation form that's going to help us assess how we can improve our education on these topics in the future. Responses collected are anonymous, so what did and didn't work. And if you could complete it by Monday, June 8th, that would be awesome. At the end of this presentation slide, or when we share out the slides with you, we're going to list the collaborators' contact information in case you want to connect with us at some point in time. But again, if you want more chances to connect on June 2nd, we'll be hosting a final, just open-ended session.